Welcome to the evaluation of IADB Group's work on climate adaptation 2016 to 2022 panel of the Evidence for Climate Action Partnership of evaluation functions of over 20 international organizations. My name is Emil Salim. I'm the Evaluation Capacity Development Team Leader at OVE IDB, and I have the great pleasure of moderating this block. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I would like to give a brief word about the Inter-American Development Bank Group and the Office of Evaluation and Oversight. The Inter-American Development Bank Group, IDB Group, is the leading source of financing and knowledge for improving lives in Latin America and the Caribbean. It comprises the IDB, which works with the region's public sector and enables the private sector. It also comprises IDB Invest, which directly supports private companies and projects, and IDB Lab, which spurs entrepreneurial innovation. Now, a word of our office, the Office of Evaluation and Oversight, OVE, of the Inter-American Development Bank. OVE delivers independent, high quality, and relevant evaluation products and services that enhance project success and strengthen institutional capacities, contributing to increased development effectiveness within the IDB group and across the Latin American and Caribbean region. The Office of Evaluation and Oversight carries out country program assessments, corporate evaluations and studies, and also thematic evaluations. And this is very important because our speaker here will speak about a thematic evaluation from OVE. Let me introduce you to Maria Fernanda Mafe Rodrigo, our speaker this morning, afternoon, or night, depending where you are. Maria Fernanda Rodrigo Mafe is an evaluation lead specialist at OVE. She holds a PhD in agricultural and applied economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has a keen interest in several areas. Of those, I will mention three: agricultural development and productive development, along with climate adaptation. Maria Fernanda, welcome to this space, and please carry on with your presentation. And to the audience, please feel free to address any questions through the chat. I will be very much attentive to your questions so I can address them to Mafe at the end of her intervention. Welcome, Mafe.
Thank you, Emil, and everybody, welcome to the presentation of the evaluation of the IDB Group's support work on climate adaptation from 2016 till 2022. So to give you a little bit of context, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second most disaster-prone region in the world. 60% of its population is concentrated in areas prone to climate events. Poor and vulnerable population, about 7 million or more people, suffer more from weather events. It is estimated that by 2030, 17 million people could be forced to move due to climate events. Adaptation interventions are crucial then to building resilience and protecting vulnerable populations. Adaptation interventions can be divided in three categories. We have anticipatory interventions, such as early warning systems and disaster risk management. We have adaptive interventions, such as resilient infrastructure, mangroves restoration, climate and smart agriculture. And also we have absorptive interventions, such as emergency response intervention. According to literature, adaptation is more effective when the three intervention types are combined than when implemented in isolation. Countries face multiple challenges from both slow and fast onset climate events, included limited knowledge of climate risk, climate vulnerabilities in goods and services, and disasters that directly affect populations. In response, we have adaptation interventions that aim to strengthen different types of capacities. Anticipatory through risk information systems that identify risk and vulnerabilities. We have adaptive interventions that create climate resilience goods and services, and absorptive that are enable systems to respond to emergencies. Together, these interventions contribute to reducing losses from climate events, maintaining access to public goods and services, and sustain economic activities. Since 2010, climate has been an IDB group priority and has been confirmed with the latest IDB group's strategy. During the period of analysis, 2016 to 2022, the IDB has approved $5.3 billion in adaptation interventions, which corresponded to 21% of approved climate finance during the period of analysis. What the evaluation did was to assess the relevance and effectiveness of IDB and IDB Invest support to adaptation. We measure relevance. In terms of relevance, we measure the integration of adaptation into strategies and the alignment of interventions with local needs. We also measure the achievement of objectives. So again, we use mixed methods. We did document review, portfolio analysis, interviews to IDB staff, IDB Invest staff, to government counterparts, and we also did field visit to 6 different countries. We visited Bahamas, Barbados, Bolivia, Brazil, Honduras, and Paraguay. We found that adaptation interventions focus in 5 sectors: environment and natural disasters, water and sanitation, urban development and housing, transport, agriculture and rural development. However, other areas with high potential for adaptation, like social protection and health, represented only between 1 to 3% of the total adaptation portfolio. Now I will summarize the findings for relevance. We assess the relevance at the country and at the portfolio level. At the country level, we use the Endgain Index, which we mapped into each country, and measures the country's overall readiness to adapt relative to its vulnerability. And we also map the IDB and IDB Invest adaptation portfolio in each country. This is relative to the whole portfolio of each country with the bank. So the darker areas reflect the vulnerability index, and again, the darker colors reflect less vulnerability, the lighter color, more vulnerability. The bigger circles reflect the IDB group portfolio in adaptation. So for example, in the Caribbean, we see countries with bigger circles like Bahamas and Barbados, and smaller circles in countries in Central America. So that's where we found low alignment in high vulnerable Central American and Caribbean countries, such as Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and other countries. At the portfolio level, we found that half of the interventions aligned with local vulnerabilities. We found limited alignment of most of anticipatory interventions due to lack of follow-up action and implementation. However, adaptive and absorptive interventions for IDB were relevant, as they could tackle climate needs or identify climate needs and vulnerabilities. For IDB Invest, most interventions had limited relevance due to lack or follow-up actions of investments related to the vulnerabilities that were identified. Now we'll summarize the findings for effectiveness. Because of the nature of adaptation, indicators to measure effectiveness would require either a natural disaster or be measured in the long term. That's why we measure progress with outcome indicators when they were available, but also with intermediate outcomes and input indicators. However, a limitation that we face was the lack of inclusion of these type of indicators or even narratives related to the adaptation components in the interventions. What worked? For IDB, we found progress. We found mixed progress for anticipatory interventions due to lack of follow-up actions. However, it was positive for adaptive and absorptive interventions, such as climate smart agriculture that combine capacity building and nature-based solutions. For IDB Invest, we had really a small portfolio that does not allow us to generalize findings, but shed light on areas for improvement. It was limited for anticipatory interventions due to follow-up actions and for adaptive interventions that were implemented through financial intermediaries. So here are some takeaways of our findings. We found that the IDB group has prioritized climate during the last decade in its strategy, even exceeding its 30% climate finance target. Efforts included new targets related to climate finance, action plans, dedicated units for climate, and even more staff dedicated to climate and staff training in cross-cutting areas. However, there's gaps between strategy and action. The strategic focus has not always led to effective adaptation interventions or more action towards adaptation. Actually, half of country strategies included in-depth climate analysis, but few proposed concrete actions to implemented interventions. Many projects did not implement the climate diagnostics that they had done, and the risk assessments were often disconnected from what the operations were doing. About half of interventions match local climate vulnerabilities. So this means that the other half did not. Adaptive interventions in infrastructure and environment were most relevant when tailored to the local needs. Also, we found that some high-need countries received limited adaptation findings, such as those in Central America. Some other findings: adaptation efforts focused on infrastructure and agriculture, which are areas where adaptation is relevant. However, sectors like tourism, health, social protections were less covered. We found also that the stronger results when policy-based loans are combined with technical cooperation and investment loans or capacity building. Local capacity building is more effective when it's embedded in the interventions. We found that private sector engagement is limited, with adaptation finance mostly reaching clients that are already motivated to doing adaptation. We need more evidence to understanding what type of interventions or what kind of combinations are needed in different contexts. In terms of effectiveness, we found that adaptive interventions were most successful, especially with climate smart agriculture, nature-based solutions. We found gray infrastructure had mixed results, even with some with negative impacts. And as a closing remark, assessing effectiveness for climate adaptation remains a challenge because of the nature of adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafe, for this presentation, for sharing the journey that the IDB has had between 2016 and 2022 regarding climate adaptation. There are very interesting findings in your research, in your evaluation. For instance, the IDB actually exceeding the target of 30% to 31% of its own ceiling of investment for climate adaptation is very relevant. also noting the gaps between strategy and action, how the relevance to vulnerabilities was effective in many cases with these interventions, and of course, the adaptation focus of infrastructure and agriculture. And it's also very interesting, the part of policy-based loans with technical cooperations and the capacity building embedded as being very much effective in the interventions. I have to tell you, we have several greetings and questions for you on the chat. So I will start with the first one, which was written by someone who's actually my friend, Arunjana Das. I will read out loud her question for you, Mafe. Arunjana wrote, considering that the disconnect between projects and climate diagnostics can have far-reaching negative impacts, what can be done to strengthen the link between diagnostics and projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, Mafe?
Thank you for the question. So currently, all IDB interventions need to do a climate risk assessment. However, what the disconnect that we found was that this assessment did not necessarily lead to the adaptation interventions that the operation was doing or was proposing to implement. So one thing that we recommended was to link these assessments to the proposed interventions. And then because usually the adaptation intervention was just the climate assessment, we recommended that the operation teams follow up upon these climate assessments, that they just not were left as just studies or assessments. They need to be implemented or follow up on.
Thank you. Yes, a very interesting alignment question, right? Because there's also in play the country priorities and the self-recognized needs, right? So I think it's a mix. Mafe, let me ask you a second question, which was written by William Stevens. Were there any generalizable findings as to why some high-need countries received limited adaptation funding?
Yes, so most of the reason why Central American countries, even though they were most vulnerable to climate adaptation and needed more readiness to understanding, was actually that the governments or the counterparts did not understand the impact that not doing adaptation could have in their countries or at the local level or regional level. So it's more of governments not demanding adaptation because they don't know or understand the extent of the damages of climate events or things like that. And this is something that countries in the Caribbean understood after Dorian. So after Dorian happened in the Bahamas, they reached out to the IDB and started asking for disaster risk management, more interventions on preparedness, and how to understand and respond to climate events. But this is because they were just hit by Dorian, which really impacted them, as opposed to countries in Central America that have less capacity and understanding about climate impacts.
Interesting. You mentioned Dorian, Mafe. This is a great example. So is it related to a demand-driven initiative by the countries as well?
Yes. So it is. This is why we recommended in the evaluations that management, even though the IDB group is a demand-driven institution, we recommended that through technical cooperation, technical assistance, showcase examples to help strengthening capacities at the local level, governmental level, so they understand the need of included adaptation in their portfolios.
How interesting, the capacity development component. Thanks for sharing. We have another very interesting question on the chat by another friend and fellow international development professional, Sabine Durier, and it reads, what sort of combination of interventions have yet to be evaluated more thoroughly in your view, or could be studied further at least?
So adaptation depends on each context. So it's different for each country or local context. Something that we found was that in Bolivia, which was the country that we found had the most complete program on adaptation. They had implemented different PBLs, programmatic reform interventions combined with investment loans and also strengthening capacity at the local level. And their program was cross-sectoral, so it touched agriculture, it touched water, it touched urban and housing, it touched transport infrastructure. So they were able, because of their local context and the need of the risk is water scarcity. That's why their program worked really well, because they are a rural country with a lot of water basins. That's why the reforms that they implemented in water, along with urban sanitation and agriculture and rural development, along with the investment loans, were really well. So what we mean when we say more evidence is needed is go to a country, study the local needs, the local context, and see what combinations work best. Because it might be that for Bolivia, working on water and sanitation and agriculture in water basins work, but it may not be the case for the dry corridor in Central America.
Great. So very interesting. So it's in a way a better, stronger understanding of a needs assessment combined with the understanding of the capacity development component of the intervention is an interested area to be evaluated more thoroughly. Thank you, Sabine Durier, for the question. And thank you, Mafe, for the answer. We have another question. This is a question on budgeting from the IDB, from Claudio Bolonte. He says, thanks, Mafe, for the presentation. How was the $5.3 billion estimated? What about the rest of the IDB portfolio? Is it vulnerable? What are they doing for adaptation?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I'm understanding correct your question. The way that we estimated the 5.3 billion, the IDB incorporates the multilateral development bank methodology to estimating climate finance. So they estimate how much they spend in each component of an intervention that is devoted to adaptation. So it's all those 4.3 billion during the period of analysis is what corresponds to the whole portfolio of adaptation. It is what it is estimated that is spent in adaptation for each operation. And it's a methodology that is joined across, that is implemented for all the multilateral development banks.
Thank you.
So I would not know, what do you mean by is it vulnerable and what are they doing for adaptation? What are they doing for adaptation? That's the 5.3 billion is all what they're doing or what they did for adaptation between 2016 and 2022.
Thank you. Thanks for unpacking how this 5.3 billion were estimated, Mafe. We have yet another question. This one is from Alexandre Eri, and it reads, what are the main drivers of the gaps between strategy and action? Is it a matter of resourcing or incentives or other factors? Very interesting.
Thank you, Alexandre. So what we found was the IDB group has different targets for climate finance. And according to what we've understand is that teams have started to incorporating climate in all they can. So it's very focused on adaptation. As for now, climate assessment, we can do an assessment here and that will count as climate finance, right? So it is not well, thoroughly, is not very well thought. So that's why we're seeing the gap. It's very much focused on alignment, on a strategy, and where teams can include anything for climate, not necessarily when they can do something meaningful for climate unless the government demands it. So it's a bit of incentives.
Thank you, Mafe. I have one last question. This is the last one, a closing question. I know you worked so hard to conduct a very thorough evaluation of the IDB Group's work for climate adaptation between 2016 and 2022. If you had to pick one recommendation for the IDB Group moving forward with these climate adaptation initiatives, what would it be?
That's a very difficult question.
Only one.
But it's the most difficult. I would say showcase countries or governments what happens if they don't include adaptation in their portfolios. Because we are a demand-driven institution, so we can just push so much. So it's showcase and try to strengthen capacity at the local and government level for our counterparts.
Thank you. So it's a recommendation at two levels, showcasing the counterfactual of what happens if you don't invest in climate and in climate action. And on the other hand, keep building local capacities, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this thoughtful answer to this last question. Thanks to everybody who followed the whole block of this Evidence for Climate Action session. I would like to thank on OVE's behalf the organizing team. You can find on screen all the organizations that made this space possible. I would very much like to also to give shout out to the World Bank's technical support team, to IAG's communication staff and people involved in this to make this happen. It was great to hear from you, Mafe, and OVE's evaluation will be made public shortly, so please be on the outlook for it. We will be sharing it through our social channels. And thank you. This was a very special event, and also it was very timely as the COP30 is being held in Brazil, in Latin America. So thank you very much to all the attendants. We had up to 19 at some point. Thanks for everyone to staying up until the end. And I hope we can be in touch to keep strengthening this dialogue, very important dialogue of the role of evidence for climate action, which is, of course, a pillar for the world of the future and for the region of the future. Thanks very much for everyone, and let's keep in touch.